This is a good conversation for Americans to have. And frankly, I think as they are able to handle it, for kids to have. But as I read the essay, I came across a couple of other statements that I wonder about. And I want to put a couple of them up on the screen. Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. And then you wrote this. We like to call those who lived during World War II the greatest generation, but that allows us to ignore the fact that many of this generation fought for democracy abroad while brutally suppressing democracy for millions of American citizens. Again, I am in no way minimizing our terrible racial legacy, but in some of these things, aren't you overstating?
How would you define democracy?
Ruled by the people.
So if you have half of the country where in some states majorities, in many other states pluralities, 25% of the population, 40% of the population cannot vote, have their vote violently suppressed, where there is single one party, one race rule in a region where about 30% of the population is Black, would you consider that a democracy?
Listen, women weren't allowed to vote until
we weren't a democracy then either. If half of the population can't vote, I don't know how you define democracy, but I don't define that as democracy.
No, I agree with that. I'm just not sure that I would say that if it weren't for Blacks, there wouldn't be a democracy at all.
Well, we know how we got democracy. It was through a decades-long Black resistance struggle called the Civil Rights Movement. That is a Black rights struggle. So you may not like the framing, but what I can tell you is the Double V for Victory campaign was Black people were fighting in an army. They were going overseas. They were dying to liberate other countries and then coming home and being lynched for wearing their uniform. They were coming home and they could not vote. They were coming home and they could see German prisoners of war going into restaurants and being served where they could not be served.
I completely agree with all of that.
Right, but you want to treat that as a marginal to the American story. But you can't call yourself the greatest democracy and the greatest democratizing force in the country while violently and brutally suppressing democracy at home. And that's what happened for millions of American citizens.
Here's where I take some objection. You're talking about, if you say the country, that we were fighting for democracy overseas and we were not living it, walking the walk, talking the talk at home, I completely agree with you. But you specifically say the greatest generation brutally suppressing, many of this generation brutally suppressing democracy for millions of Americans. To me, and I think Tom Brokaw, when he originally wrote the book, The Greatest Generation, was talking about 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds who came out of the farm fields of the Midwest, who came out of ethnic neighborhoods in Brooklyn and South Philly and stormed the beaches of Normandy and you know, fought to defeat the worst regime, I would argue, in world history. And to say that they were 20, 30-year-olds. The country was brutally suppressing Blacks, but the greatest generation wasn't.
Well, they were.
I mean, they weren't. You're telling me that a kid coming off a farm in Indiana or a kid who came from Brooklyn was suppressing
Indiana
Black
had
people?
the largest population of the Klan in the United States. The Klan was
I understand, but that wasn't the 20-year-old kid who
You don't think 20-year-olds were in the Klan? You don't think 20-year-olds were fighting?
I don't think many of them were, no.
I mean, I don't know what evidence you have of that.
Well, what evidence do you have that they were?
I didn't argue that they were. You're saying what they weren't.
You said many of this generation was brutally suppressing democracy for millions of Americans.
And that's factually inaccurate. How many of that generation were? Do you think that the only people?
You think that you're? I'm just asking.
Go ahead.
You think that's a broad brush that you're willing to paint the 20 and 30-year-olds who defended democracy? I'm not talking about the leaders. I'm not talking about the laws. I'm not talking about the country. I'm talking about the young people who risked their lives. For instance, on the beaches of Normandy, they were brutally suppressing African Americans.
One, I think it's a strange point to parse. Two, I don't
Why? That's who the
think of a
greatest generation
30-year-old.
was.
A 30-year-old is not a young person. A 30-year-old is a fully grown person who can serve in Congress, who can be the mayor, who can enact laws and policies. These are not children. These are not babies. We wouldn't parse this, I think, if we were talking again about another country and say, well, yes, the government was violently suppressing, but everyone else, they weren't. They were glorious. You don't do that. This is an argument about what our country was allowing. These were countrymen, and they were fighting, by the way, in a Jim Crow military. They were fighting in an army, in the Navy, where black people were segregated, where black people didn't even have equal rights in the military they were serving in. And we all allowed this. I don't understand this trying to parse off who gets guilt or who does not for our collective history. We have to be more honest about piercing that mythology, not to destroy our country, but to, if we can honestly face who we are, then we can actually become the country that we want to be. But we can't do that by suppressing the truth. And to ask a black person whose view of the greatest generation was black people were getting lynched. There were mass executions. I mean, right now they're trying to pardon a mass execution of black soldiers that happened in Texas, right? This was our experience. And we were feeling more free going to Europe. And actually, there are stories of military officials telling the Europeans how to treat black soldiers so that they don't come back feeling they're going to have those same freedoms at home. We have to confront that. And by having these gauzy narratives about the greatest generation doesn't help us confront the facts.
That was good.
Oh, well, thank you. Very passionate about this. And let me just say, I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this.
Good. I am too. This is just what this is here for.